Thanks so much, Eugene and Sharon, for inviting me to join in the conversation about information governance. Um, as you've already mentioned, I've been working in the sector a long time, first as a practitioner and now as a consultant. Although I've also been working as a consultant for a pretty long time. I did the maths the other day and realized it was 25 years, which is possibly very long. I possibly can't call myself a practitioner anymore. But anyway, what I've been doing is sort of working with a wide range of clients from all types of sectors. And I think still in all this time, we still find that we grapple with the whole concept of information governance. What is it? What does it mean for your organization? How do I do it? And so forth. So what we're going to go, so throughout the presentation, what I'm aiming to do is sort of cover a little bit around definitions, bit more around the key elements of information governance, through onto then some case studies. So essentially trying to put something into practice, because otherwise it's a bit, really theoretical. And what I will say is, as we're going through the slides, I would quite like to be, more interactive if you're comfortable to do so. So really welcome all questions, comments, insights as they arise. Feel free just to interrupt. I really don't mind being interrupted and having a conversation. And I'll sort of have Sharon and Eugene also keeping an eye out in case you put your hand up, and then they can stop me in mid-flow. But I think that, this is all around us learning from each other as well. Because, as we go through, certainly one of my key messages is there's no right or wrong way. There's just a number of different ways that this can be attacked and looked at. So that's a little bit about what I'm planning to do. So I'm going to move straight on really into definitions. So when Eugene and Sharon asked me to do this presentation, I thought I'd go back to the sort of drawing board, if you like, and sort of start thinking about what are these definitions? What is the, what do the dictionaries say, if you like, and what do the experts in the field say? So we've got dictionaries like the Oxford English Dictionary defining governance as the action or manner of governing a state or organization. The Cambridge Dictionary defining governance as the way that organizations, countries are managed at the highest level and the systems for doing that. And the Merriam-Webster Dictionary defining governance as the act or process of governing or overseeing the control and the direction of something, such as a country or an organization. But, of course, that's fine having that single definition of governance as so, but we also know that governance is, I suppose, attributed to and used, by a lot of other disciplines and different fields. One of the most, I suppose at its broadest sense, if we're talking in a corporate environment, we have corporate governance, which is, defined by the Chartered Institute of the UK and Ireland as governance is a system that provides a framework for managing organizations. It identifies who can make decisions, who has the authority to act on behalf of the organization, and who is accountable on how the organization and its people perform. We've also got into corporate governance, the Australian Governance Institute, where they talk about governance encompassing the system by which an organization is controlled and operates, its mechanisms by which its people are held to account, ethics, risk management, compliance, and administration are all elements of governance. And it's not just so that's a sort of at its highest level, some of the definitions of governance. But here we're really here to talk about information governance. So let's drill down a bit deeper into our own discipline. And in looking around for definitions, I found some definitions by some of our professional bodies like ARMA and AIM. Certainly in the UK, which for me was quite interesting, I didn't find one from RMS, which is our industry body. They've chosen not to provide any of those sort of definitions along the way. But for ARMA, and I have to say for ARMA, this is one that possibly resonates with me the most, which talks, and this is a definition that's been found in their guide to the information profession. Information governance is the overarching and coordinating strategy for all organizational information. It establishes the authorities, supports, processes, capabilities, structures, and infrastructure to enable information to be a useful asset and reduce liability to the organization based on the organization's specific requirements and risk tolerance. And for me, that's quite encompassing. And I've got an alternative one from Gartner, which, you know, and I mean, you all know Gartner, and Gartner is certainly a publication and a body that more people than the information profession, I mean, you know, really IT profession and other professions look to Gartner for some of these definitions. So I think it's quite useful for us to be aware of how Gartner sees us as well, because they certainly do have an impact on our lives. And Gartner define information governance as the specification of decision rights and an accountability framework to ensure appropriate behavior in the valuation, creation, storage, use, archiving, and deletion of information. It includes the processes, roles, policies, standards, metrics that ensure the effective and efficient use of information, should I say, in enabling the organization to achieve its goals. So I find it interesting that Gartner is the one that mentions the life cycle, whereas someone like ARMA doesn't. They look at it in perhaps a slightly more holistic view. But carrying on, just looking at web definitions, or definitions that I found on the web, there were quite a few that were within the NHS, National Health Service in England. But what was really interesting with those is if you do look at them, they focus very much on personal information and data handling, and looking to sort of handle information in a secure and confidential manner. And they talk about very much about their framework governing the use of personal data. And I mean, I think from my perspective, I mean, you know, nobody can dispute the requirement to manage personal data, but actually, or personal information. But for me, it's only one category of information. But, you know, everything needs to be governed, not just personal data. But I mean, you know, one assumes that that sort of reflects maybe the NHS's, you know, view about the fact, I mean, they just hold so much personal data and so much sensitive personal data that that's where their biggest risk is. So that's what they're most worried about. But before we leave definitions, I suppose I just also want to bring in and remind everybody that although we're talking about information governance, there are allied professions that work with information or alongside information that also have governance, you know, that talk about governance in their own right. So people like IT, information security or cybersecurity, if you prefer, and data governance. So, you know, and they all also work within our, I suppose, our universe, if you like, and they are worth just being aware of. And they impact, to my mind, they impact on information governance more broadly. So IT governance really focuses more on the, if you look at the definitions, on the sort of the governance of the IT infrastructure itself. How is it procured, developed, designed, taken into service, and that infrastructure being looked after and maintained? And essentially what the sort of aim of the governance that I can see in terms of definitions looks like they are trying to ensure that they are following proven methodologies, best practices, and, you know, those principles of quality to align the IT efforts to the business. So that's sort of really where they focus in. Information security or cyber security governance focuses very much on, I suppose, the control of, you know, the organization's approach to cyber security or cyber risk. Their frameworks tend to focus on policies and practices and strategies to protect the organization's assets. So for me, they're quite important to think about in terms of the information governance as well, because there is always a protection element within governance or information governance. And then the last one, and this possibly is quite interesting for a number of us that straddle both the unstructured world as well as the structured world. So there's a definition around data governance, which typically focuses, you know, very much on governance at the data level, at specific data entities, making sure that the data in an organization, you know, that an organization is gathering and inputting is true and accurate and unique. It involves, you know, the data governance sort of frameworks there would involve data cleansing, stripping out perhaps corrupted data or inaccurate data, as well as extraneous data, deduplication, and so forth. And organizations, in terms of data governance, will often talk about the use of master data management, you know, both the tools and techniques to clean their data and to leverage business rules to prevent the inaccuracy of data that's been collected. And master data management, you know, seeks to standardize the data and ensure there's single versions of the truth along that way. So, I mean, for me, and I don't know, you know, if anybody else has any thoughts about these definitions, but I think that all of these definitions are valid, and particularly if we're thinking about the allied disciplines, you know, some of the IT governance ideas and in cybersecurity and data governance, and local context tends to start blurring those boundaries. And actually, one of the case studies I've got is exactly that, the blurring of the boundaries actually between information and data, which I think is quite interesting. But in effect, when we are talking about, you know, if we look at the definitions, what have they got in common? They're always talking about a process of interactions through laws or social norms, some sort of system. And I'm not necessarily talking about an IT system, but a system of organization, which also then consists of defined authorities, establishing rules, guidelines, things like that. So there's a number of those, you know, common threads throughout all those definitions. And I suppose just before I move on to talk about what are the key elements within information governance and drill down into some of the detail, I wondered if anybody has any observations at this point that they want to share.
Maybe observation and the question. So I think when practically in an organization you implement a governance policy of one kind or another, you typically set some fairly specific goals. So if you're talking about data governance, talking about data quality, right? So your goal is to make sure that you have quality data for decision making and so on and so forth. Have you seen it any different when people talk about information management?
Yes, I think so, Eugene. I mean, my two case studies are interesting because they show two very different perspectives. So I think part of the starting, when we're talking about, you know, a governance framework, or, you know, and whether that's information governance or data governance or whatever, there is an element of understanding what the priority is, and that will actually shape some of your governance design, if you like, because you are responding to your local context. You know, and I just, it's what makes the area, to be blunt, very fascinating, but difficult, because there isn't a truth. There isn't a, you know, this is not set in stone that I can turn around and say, well, information governance is that. Actually, every place I've worked, looks at this slightly differently, and you've got to flex, pivot, call it what you will, but you've got to shift you've got to shift, you know what the elements are, and you shift and you morph those elements to meet a local requirement, as opposed to just doing this is the only way that you can do that, would be my first, my observation. So if there's nothing else, I'll move on to the key elements. So what I'm trying to shift to now is move us away from just talking theoretically about, what is information governance and so forth, to think about what are the key elements that make up information governance. Now, I would say, back to the question, Eugene's question, and my answer in a way is, I would use this as a starting point to think which bits work, but I wouldn't use it, and I wouldn't just lift and shift and say a governance has to have all of these things. I think some of them are lighter than others, depending on the organization. But what I want to do is go through some of these elements and not just say what these elements are, but I'd like to actually open them up to say, this is what it means. This is what it would look like in practice, or what it could look like in practice, because I'm not trying to prescribe to you what something should be, rather what it could look like. I think that governance is when we're talking about putting together an information governance framework or something like that, we're not just talking about a document, here it is, let's go away now. It's actually a practice. It's something that you're doing for a real outcome. Yes, there will be artifacts that come out of it, and sometimes that could be a governance document or some other elements of artifacts, but it's a little bit broader. Sorry, I feel like I'm not explaining that very well. So I will take questions if I'm talking double Dutch. But I do, I think as I go through some of these elements, then hopefully that starts becoming a bit clearer. So if we start with the first one, which is really the roles and responsibilities, there's a whole bit in governance, and all the definitions talk about it, roles and responsibilities. And for me, that can mean loads of different things. You need to be thinking about roles and responsibilities, both from an organizational perspective, as well as from an individual perspective. So let's start with the individual and work to the organization. So the reality is things like establishing, who is the senior, SRO or whatever initials you would use in your organization, but the senior most responsible person for information governance, for information. In government, UK government terms, it could be a CIRO, for instance, Senior Information Responsible Officer, which is possibly quite old-fashioned now, or it could be, an executive sponsor. Typically, what you're looking for is somebody who is a director, who's got enough clout, who's sitting at the top table. So ideally, somebody in your C-suite, who does actually, this matters to us. We worry about it. But then you're looking further down, and you're then looking at, I don't know, the owners of data owners or asset owners or information asset owners. I mean, there's a number of terms that are used in this space, but it's the people who are working with the information or the data. And then you might have champions, again, the word champion, people sometimes call them, super users, and so on. So there's a number of terms, but it's sort of people who get it, who are in the business area, who would sort of essentially champion the role and help the sort of the users on the ground. And then you've got the users. So you've got all these individuals, but then within the organization, you've also got, I suppose, bigger roles or bigger organizational entities. So, you know, you'd want to think about it from an organizational perspective, like a steering group or a working group that has got representatives from all the allied areas. So, you know, IT, cyber, data privacy, maybe legal or risk, plus business units who see who can there, and then from the business themselves, so that you've got this bigger view of the whole organization. And then you've got, so you sort of got this group that is making decisions really, or ratifying decisions. So in the roles and responsibilities, you're also looking at the teams that work with information or data, and who are they and how do they fit together. So what you're trying to do is a little bit of a jigsaw of mapping all the different roles that already exist. I mean, personally, I wouldn't say start again. I'd say see what's there and then see how it knits together. Because what you're trying not to do is make this an industry within itself. Because let's be blunt, most organizations are lean and mean, with, not that much, not that large a resource. So what you're looking at is a level of proportionality and pragmatism to the organization, to their budgets. And you want to use existing frameworks or existing governance arrangements that are already there, trying to piggyback on, because what you don't want is another set of bureaucracy that somebody says, so you're information governance, but there's data governance here, and there's architecture governance there, and how does everything fit? You need to be able to be quite clear around that, because otherwise all you're doing is confusing everybody. So I'll give you an example, and it's actually from my case study. One of my case studies, a charity that already had a senior decision-making group called, is it DDT? So it was digital data and technology. But they never looked at content. I was like, really? How can you not? So in discussions, in trying to put together their framework of how they, that's the roles and responsibilities bit, we agreed that group was a really good group to actually also look at the content, to be the ultimate decision maker and ratify decisions, because they were all they were all directors, they were senior members, and they could influence that direction. So what you're trying to do is see if you can use people from that way. And then moving on to authorities. So, here we've got establishing the boundaries. What are the rules, principles applied to information? What are your standards? What is the legal regulatory obligations that you're operating in? Because they will give you, again, your guardrails. Now, over this, I would say that, yes, as information managers, we know quite a lot of them already, but I would also make sure I'm reaching out to the legal team, to different departments who manage content, because they should also know what their obligations are, or help them understand those obligations. And this bit of authority, this element, actually helps you and define what controls are needed for your information or your data. What are the controls that you want to apply? And when I say translate, for me, it's a really important element that information managers sometimes miss, which is actually thinking about this in local context. So what does the organization do? What does it worry about? Let's think about that and apply the controls proportionately. Because again, you could tie something up to the nth degree in a beautiful red bow, but actually it's impossible to work with. And all you're doing is you're losing your users along the way. The next one I've got on my list is the architecture. Obviously the building blocks to structuring and organizing your information. We're talking about the typical areas like, taxonomies, metadata, domain models, all of that good stuff. And for me, it's also one of those areas that in helping govern it, you are helping have some control around how the organization is structured, which also then helps, the business to see value of its information in terms of findability, combining to make new knowledge, combining to have new insights, reducing the wastage of rework, supporting corporate memory. So it's all of those good things. I mean, there's a whole lot of value that comes out of that space that you'd want to govern completely. Otherwise, you're back to your Wild West before. Next one I'm going to talk about is the supporting infrastructure. And this is what it says on the tin. This is much more the IT structures, the capabilities, the applications, the platforms, the requirements around information security. And here, what is important is we can't manage and govern our information without the infrastructure, without IT. It is our tools that we work with. And really, it's vital that IT and IM are close friends and allies, that we work together to put the right controls in. And you need a close working relationship that IM can say, well, I would like to control the information in this way, and IT can help define what does that look like within this application or this platform, because you've got to work with the platform you've got. And what you're trying to do is clearly make it as easy and seamless as possible for the users that, hopefully, I mean, my nirvana is always information governance by stealth, so that the users don't know they are using their information, but actually there's good stuff going around in the background, and you need IT, you need good infrastructure, you need some of this framework to be able to define that. We've got the processes through lifecycle management. What are the rules? What are the controls that we are applying to the management of information, right through from receipt or creation through to its eventual destruction? Everywhere along that path needs some level of oversight and governance, and it's just understanding how that fits together. And then the last one that I'm going to cover at this point is the procedural, the capabilities and the processes. This is sort of more the procedural framework. It's still policies, your procedures, your processes, and the capabilities. What are the skills that you need? And even from an information management person, don't underestimate the skills that you need to be able to translate what you want to the users. And it's no good writing loads and loads and loads of documentation, because I don't know how you are, but I don't read it. I have been to so many clients where they have got, every time something goes wrong, they write another piece of guidance, and the users don't read it. They don't care. They're busy. They're doing their job. So there is a skill from our perspective that we've got to develop, and a capability we've got to develop around how to write the least amount with the best amount of impact, that people can find what they need when they need it, as opposed to making them read, long documents that just are war and peace around that. So what I'm hoping that you're hearing from this around, if you like, the more practical application of information governance, is that the key message is this isn't an IT-led activity. It has to be more of an information-led or a data-led, but IT is a massive stakeholder. You cannot lose them along the way. But, they are absolutely core in helping you realize. And actually, you are core in helping IT apply their governance around making sure the platforms are used right, the platforms aren't overloaded with junk, or items that are no longer required, I should say, and so forth. So, there is a symbiotic relationship. And I mean, when I started in this profession, IT was often seen as, well, IT and IM, let's say, rubbed each other the wrong way. IM was perhaps seen as somebody putting barriers in front of IT just getting on and delivering, and IM would see IT throwing something over the wall, and then we feel like we were left to pick up the pieces. Now, both arguments are right, but they're also wrong, because we need to acknowledge colleagues' skills and what they bring into their party and their priorities and their view perspective. And I mean, I have to say, in the last 10 years, the last 5 years especially, that relationship between IT and IM has gone a whole 360. And I so rarely work on a project now where people say, I can't get on with IT are not helpful. I have the most amazing conversations with IT colleagues who get it and are looking for information governance help. So, I think I really want to, if there's anything else I can do, is to move us on. And I don't think any of us are there anymore. I think that is long gone. So what I'm going to do, and I'm just keeping an eye on time, is I'd quite like to bring some of this to life with a couple of case studies. The first one is really a charity. And it's a charity, and like most charities, they have got very little money. They operate off a shoestring. Everybody does a lot for very little. They use the word data. So, Eugene, this is back to where I was starting when we spoke a little bit earlier. So all their content they talk about is data. They don't differentiate structured and unstructured. It's all data. But their biggest focus was actually their structured. Their driver was the fact that they are replacing their CRM, and they recognize that they've got data in a number of different databases that isn't standard, that isn't talking to each other. So the whole, and Fran, I think this will talk to you very much, they didn't really have an architecture. So they were using different, different terms for the same entities and so on. So the ability to transfer data between systems and trust what you're transferring was massive. They also do have a lot of unstructured content, but somehow they've managed to not think too much about that, which is a bit of a worry because they have got so much personal data. So again, their driver was very regulatory, but actually it was more about getting value from their data. So compliance was a secondary feature for them. And what we did was really needed, it was called a data governance piece of work. In the end, we had to take out the word governance because the data privacy people were using that governance word already. They were called information governance. So we had to rethink. So the start of the engagement was actually talking a little bit about the nomenclature and getting a view on it. And in the end, we settled on information and data. Feels like a mouthful, and it is a mouthful, but it was a way of trying to work users to understand that it's both structured and unstructured, because people were talking about data, but by and large, they were thinking about their CRM and they weren't thinking about anything else. So we sort of try to start getting some of that common vocabulary. And we created a data management framework. And as I say, framework was because the word governance had already been taken by another team already, so we couldn't have another governance word. And really, the framework was created to address the sort of roles and responsibilities, the key principles. So what are those operating rules? And then some key policies, as well as some very high-level processes. So how are you going to look after this? So some really practical things. And as part of that work, we created a number of artifacts. One was the framework already, an information governance framework document that pulled this all together. But the other was actually, bread and butter, an information and data asset register. Because they didn't have that. They didn't know what they had. They didn't know where it was. They didn't have an IT asset register. They sort of had a record of processing, but it was quite unusual, possibly slightly different to one that I've seen in other places. But We also then created, sort of looking at their data to create a data domain model, so we knew what their data world looked like, and this is all their information and data, so that whole world looked like. And then from that, started pulling together a data dictionary and some taxonomies. And we are now working with them to hand that over and think about a governance process, actually a mini governance process for those taxonomies. It's already formed part of the information and data framework, but we're pulling it out a little bit to give people a bit more detail. So, when we did the work, we took account of data protection, as well as IT. Didn't talk much about information security because they had a vacancy. They didn't have anybody there. They had a lot of good data protection processes, but they were highly detailed, and they were one of the people I'm talking about where nobody reads it. It's just, documents and documents of everything. And I try to map their processes, and I found myself getting lost, which was quite worrying. So if you go back and we think about the key elements, what we touched on here was roles and responsibilities, the architecture, a little bit of the infrastructure, and some of the procedural life cycle elements. But what we didn't touch on at all were things like infrastructure, and also the authorities. We just took what we knew, because they wanted to focus on something slightly different. And then my next case study is a UK regulator. Now, their drivers are different. Really interesting, because what they were concerned about was the risk to their information. And they spoke more about information because they had a data team that looked after all the databases. So they were less worried about their data, and they were more worried about their unstructured information. So everything on their EDRMS, their network drives, SharePoint, OneDrive, email, everywhere else that we know are these sort of like hidden areas where there's little smoking bombs waiting to go off. And they were concerned because they hadn't really adequately wrapped their arms around what they had. Again, they didn't know what they had, who had it, where it was. They hadn't actually had any controls applied to to their information. So for them, this was a worry. So they what we did with them was we started, first of all, with a bit of a discovery piece, consulting the areas of the business to how they manage their information, what their requirements were, what they did through the life cycle, also thinking about the issues and challenges that they were coming across, what worked well, what didn't work well, what was coming down the line, so what the future world looked like. So that what we could do was create, if you like, a set of information management, information governance requirements, both for systems. So this is how we want to manage our information, which could be applied to all new systems, but also to existing systems, so that we knew what we needed to fix. We also, from that set of requirements, was able to extrapolate that into a maturity model, so that we could see where they were good, bad, indifferent. And that then allowed one to build the sort of roadmap. And for them, their governance framework that we pulled together for them was around roles and responsibilities again, because they had issues about ownership, as a lot of people do. But they were very interested in the information risks. So we had identified the information risks, and then put together a set of information management principles, including the controls that were needed to manage, to meet those principles, as well as a roadmap for remediation. And the roadmap for remediation even took into account the information risks, the information management principles, and that maturity model. So what did they need to do and how far did they need to go? So as part of the project, we looked at information asset registers. We created a retention schedule. We did some maturity model work. We also identified key information management frameworks. And, so, if we think about let's go back again to the key elements, what we did was we established the authorities, we established the roles, we had some procedural frameworks, we had some life cycle management. Sorry, I must put my teeth back in, and some infrastructure work. But the one thing we never did, and Fran, please don't fall on your sword, was information architecture. They were more worried about controlling it than they were structuring it, which personally I think was a massive loss, particularly since we did a couple of other projects with them and we discovered why it was such a loss. But again, this was them cutting the cloth according to what they had. So, in conclusion, really, I think what I want to do is just highlight the fact that there is no right or wrong. What I, on the sort of years of working in the space, and hopefully from these case studies, you can see how different they were. And I did choose them because they were so diametrically opposed that you could see the sort of range. IG absolutely must reflect your organization's context and priorities and their risk appetite. So where do they sit with this? What's keeping them awake at night? The other side is, and it's a hard message to do, IG is an ongoing journey. We start here, and then you slowly start building the bits and artifacts. And yes, you might not, if you think about the elements, you might not do all of them, but you'll do them all slowly. You might do some first because there's a whole prioritization about what's your burning platforms, basically. I think that you do need to be very clear about the boundaries. So where do you sit? Where does IT sit? Where does data governance sit? As in data privacy, should I say? And information security, and it all needs to start knitting together, really. And then my last thought is really about, please don't get stuck on definitions between data, information, content, knowledge, because to be blunt, they matter less to our clients than they do to us as professionals. Yes, knowing the definitions and having some idea of them is great, but when you're working with your client, essentially you are flexing around that. So, my charity client, I was using the word data. Now, it sort of doesn't sit really well with me, but it was like, well, that's how they called it. That's what they know it as. So you think about it in those terms. And actually with the charity client, we were all in part of our governance framework. We were also looking at some of the, if you like, pure data governance world, like deduplication, cleaning the data, and so on. So we pulled that in. So we actually ended up morphing a little bit of what would be pure information, if you like, unstructured information governance and data governance. So I feel like I've spoken very fast because I suddenly realized I had a lot to say. So I hope that makes sense. I'd like to say thank you. And I'd really like to take any questions or comments, because nobody sort of disturbed me during mid-flow. And that was either because I was talking too fast that you couldn't get in, or what, I don't know. So I open the floor.